You're listening to the Cyberwire Network, powered by N2K.
Devices that aren't IT systems, that aren't end-user laptops or desktops or servers in a data center, are starting to get attacked at kind of higher and higher frequency. And, spacecraft are very interesting targets from a national security perspective.
Hello and welcome to Caveat, N2K Cyberwire's privacy, surveillance, law, and policy podcast. I'm Dave Bittner, and joining me is my co-host Ben Yelland from the University of Maryland Center for Health and Homeland Security. Hey there, Ben.
Hello, Dave.
On today's show, Ben discusses the latest antitrust case against Google. I look at Las Vegas police refusing the NFL's mandate for facial recognition security. And later in the show, my conversation with Shane Fry, Chief Technology Officer at RunSafe Security. We're talking about the Spacecraft Security Act. While this show covers legal topics and Ben is a lawyer, the views expressed do not constitute legal advice. For official legal advice on any of the topics we cover, please contact your attorney. Hey everybody, Dave here. Have you ever wondered where your personal information is lurking online? Like many of you, I was concerned about my data being sold by data brokers. So I decided to try Delete Me. I have to say, Delete Me is a game changer. Within days of signing up, they started removing my personal information from hundreds of data brokers. I finally have peace of mind knowing my data privacy is protected. Delete Me's team does all the work for you with detailed reports, so you know exactly what's been done. Take control of your data and keep your private life private by signing up for Delete Me. Now at a special discount for our listeners. Today, get 20% off your Delete Me plan when you go to joindeleteme.com/N2K and use promo code N2K at checkout. The only way to get 20% off is to go to joindeleteme.com/N2K and enter code N2K at checkout. That's joindeleteme.com/N2K, code N2K. All right, Ben, let's jump in here. We got some good stories to cover here this week. You want to kick things off for us?
Sure. So Google has been spending a lot of time in court because they're facing a lot of antitrust cases. We have a Department of Justice who's going hard at big tech companies, and Google is caught in the crossfire here. So this newest case has to do with ad tech. When we use Google Chrome, for example, we log in with our Gmail username and password. It establishes that we are the ones who are using the browser. It starts to collect information on us based on our browsing history, based on the posts we make on social media, based on our email inbox. And those ads are pretty much embedded on every website we go to. I'm currently looking at the Ars Technica article that covers this case. And sure enough, I have that little ad choices mark for an eye doctor on the upper right-hand side of my screen. So it's something that is completely ubiquitous. And this is the cause of the latest DOJ case that we have. Google already lost in court as it related to its search engine monopoly, and that case is still being adjudicated. The federal courts are trying to figure out what the remedy is for that case. On this ad issue, we are still in the preliminary phases of the case. It is being heard in front of a federal court in Virginia, and the ad tech case has only made it to opening arguments.
Okay.
So the DOJ has argued that Google broke competition in ad tech space by, quote, engaging in a systematic campaign to seize control of the wide swath of high-tech tools used by publishers, advertisers, and brokers to facilitate digital advertising. And the result of such insidious, allegedly anti-competitive behavior is that Google pockets at least 30 cents of every advertising dollar flowing from advertisers to website publishers through their ad tech tools. The allegation, if you really want to sum it up, is that because of Google's monopoly in search engine optimization, the fact that people are searching on Google, because of their general market share, companies basically see the only profitable way to get advertising out there is to use this ad choices option, which Google owns and controls. And Google charges a fee, takes a cut of money that would otherwise be going to the host of the website. And they do that through various anti-competitive practices by making it difficult for any other advertiser to display in the same location. By doing that, you're taking money not only away from the advertiser, but it's also an extra cost you're taking money away not only from the owner of the website, but it's also an extra cost on the advertiser. Where if there were further competition in the market, then the advertiser would have meaningful choice. They could spend money on one of the other big tech companies who probably would own ad space in the absence of what Google is doing here. But I think just instinctively, this seems like a very strong case against Google. It could lead to some pretty extreme results. The Department of Justice is asking the judge to order a divestment of Google's Ad Manager suite of services, which is responsible for those rectangular ads that populate the tops and sides of web pages across the internet. Because this is the obvious remedy, this sort of demand that Google sell off its majority investment in these businesses, this case potentially could be more harmful to Google's bottom line than the search engine trial. It could set the stage, one expert says, for splitting Google into a separate search and advertising companies. The DOJ says this is necessary to restore competition in these markets, to stop Google's anti-competitive practices, their anti-competitive acquisitions. But Google, of course, is claiming in their defense that they've created a valuable ad product, particularly for small businesses. Because of how ubiquitous they are, it is a one-stop shop for small businesses to use this Google-based advertisement tool, show up on these websites at a relatively minimal cost to them. And what Google is saying is if the Department of Justice wins this case and Google is forced to divest, it's just going to become a much more difficult to navigate landscape for small business owners. So it's a really interesting case. I'm curious to see, obviously, how the judge is going to rule here. This is going to be a bench trial, so there is no jury. It is up to the judge's discretion. And we will see if Google's ad empire comes crashing down.
It's interesting to me in like the makeup of what we're arguing over here is that from the point of view of a small business, right?
Right.
When Google's technology came to be, small businesses said, wow, this is so much better than the alternatives I used to have. I used to put an ad in the Yellow Pages. I used to put an ad in the local newspaper. And maybe I'd run an ad on TV. And people would come to my shop or my service or whatever it was. And it was that old joke, from the Mad Men era of, I know I'm wasting half of my ad dollars. The problem is I don't know which half.
Right.
And Google lets you know which half, right? Because you got all these analytics. So it's interesting to me.
And you have no access to these analytics, obviously, unless you use Google's tools.
Right, right. Now, it's interesting to me that there's no question that what Google is offering is a better value than the existing alternatives in the market for small businesses. And that's the case Google's trying to make here. But at the same time, because Google has almost complete control of that market, that puts them in the position of basically being able to charge whatever they want. As long as it's less than the non-online electronic, versions of what the old school way of coming at this. And that's an interesting setup to me. Do you see where I'm coming from with this?
Yeah, I do. I think that has to do with Google's dominant market position here.
Right.
And they are able to use that market position to take these anti-competitive actions by forging an exclusive link between Google's ads, Google's publisher ad server, and the advertiser's demand, which is a way of cutting off competitors.
Right.
So one of the things that the DOJ alleges here is that if publishers wanted to access exclusive Google Ads advertising demand, they had to use Google's publisher ad server rather than an equivalent tool offered by a Microsoft or another rival. So it's positioning itself as a buyer, seller, and auctioneer of digital display advertising by just sort of, I don't even know what the proper metaphor would be here, but making itself the entire internet ad market.
Right.
In basically all of its forms. Their bet, Google's bet is, and this is something that the DOJ mentions in its complaint, is that publishers are not going to switch ad platforms. There are significantly high costs to do so. Obviously, you have to redesign your website, and you have to rely on an advertising platform that doesn't have the same reputation. And obviously, there are risks involved. If you're the first company that abandons this type of Google advertisement, you could put yourself at a negative position relative to your competitors. And I think some of the best evidence of Google's domination here is that there aren't any equivalent publisher ad servers that have entered the market. So it's not merely an allegation that Google controls all facets of this market. They do control all facets of this market.
Right. So suppose the DOJ is successful here and they split Google up and they make their ad business its own standalone business, right?
Right.
They're still a giant. Like how are we then relying on one of the other giants, the Microsofts of the world, the Amazons, the Metas, to come in with all the power that they have to now have better access to this market? Is that what we're aiming for here?
I mean, I think that would be the natural resolution of Google's ad services being broken up, which is not exactly satisfying for the consumer.
Right.
If you're a small business, I think you're less concerned about pie-in-the-sky ideas related to ad monopolies, and you just want to have an easy platform where you understand that Google takes a cut. But to operate your website, you use this easy-to-use service. Everybody else uses it.
Right.
And yeah, I don't think the result of this is that there's going to be VCs investing in enterprising ad services. It's not going to become like a startup market. It is going to go to the other big guys, which is that really the result that we want here? I don't know. That's why perhaps the remedy portion of this is going to be the most difficult element of this case. You could establish that Google does have a monopoly here, that they're engaging in anti-competitive practices. But if the solution would make things worse than the problem being identified, is it worth finding in favor of the Department of Justice and going through with that remedy? And that's something that the judge is going to have to consider. I also want to just briefly mention that there are downstream effects to Google's dominance in this marketplace in terms of losing competition to sites that have tried to make do with paywalls, just because Google advertising is such an easy way for publishers to gain revenue. It creates a competitive disadvantage for anybody trying to go about it in a different way, not having ads pop up on the screen, but having some type of subscription service. And as a result, because of reliance on Google's advertisements, the publisher of, or I guess it was the CEO of Gannett Publishing, which Gannett, I think, is the largest owner of newspapers and newspaper websites across the country, said that it makes its product worse because revenue is unstable, the user experience isn't as good, but there's no way that they could properly operate their business without using Google advertising. So I think that's just another interesting downstream result from what the Department of Justice is alleging here.
Yeah, you gotta rely on clickbait articles because you want the traffic to put eyeballs in front of the ads, and it's this whole,
And it really,
circle.
I think, is not pleasant for the user experience.
Yeah.
You either have to pay to get behind a paywall, or you're just bombarded with these carefully curated advertisements that make the user experience worse. Now, we're all used to it, and we're used to scrolling pages where ads are appearing on every corner of our screen, and we're being forced to click that little X to get out of those advertisements.
Right.
But it still, I think, is detrimental to the user experience in a way that if there were some type of competitive market here, maybe that wouldn't be the case. Maybe somebody else would figure out a way so that publishers could maintain their source of revenue without these ads popping up all over our faces and all over our sites. And I don't know if that's possible. I don't know if that would be the ultimate result of a potential remedy here, but I think it's something to think about.
Yeah. What sort of timeline are we on here?
Bad news. Long timeline.
Okay. Whenever I ask you that question, I should know. It's almost rhetorical, right?
It is. Very rarely am I gonna be like, there's gonna be a
next week
permanent resolution to this issue that we're all gonna be happy with over the next week.
Right.
We are just in the opening statements phase of this trial. I believe that Google called their first witness. So we're in the beginning phases of this trial. We expect the trial to last through much of the fall and to get a decision on the merits and on the remedy by, say, January of 2025, which sounds great. But then obviously the loser of this case is going to appeal to the federal circuit courts. That takes a lot of time. So, yeah, I mean, it could be a while. I will say, though, that we thought that Google search engine monopoly case was going to be never ending. And though we have yet to see the remedy in that case, we did get a resolution. So sometimes things do happen, and we will certainly be here to cover it.
So how much, if at all, does the search engine decision affect this one? Does this one exist in a vacuum where they do not consider what has already happened with the search engine one, or can that one be used in this case as well?
It cannot be used in this case because these are completely separate allegations and we're talking about completely separate markets.
Okay.
It just happens to be that they're both Google cases because Google has a monopoly on a bunch of different things. But for every antitrust case, it's the same elements that you have to establish, that there is some type of market here and that the company is excluding potential competition and taking anti-competitive actions. You have to prove that in both the search engine case and for this advertising case. So, it's something that the judge probably takes into consideration, that the sky isn't going to come falling down upon us if he rules against the behemoth Google.
Yeah.
But it's not something that's supposed to factor into his legal considerations here because this is a completely separate market.
Well, I wish the judge well because I have to say I'm having trouble imagining a sensible remedy to this. I'm sure, obviously people who are much smarter than I have come up with them, but I haven't seen one yet that seems satisfying and also practical.
Me neither. I mean, I wish we could live in a world where companies didn't feel forced to put more junky ads on their websites or to put more content behind paywalls to cover the cost of advertising or to go out of business altogether, which has happened.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, I hope they can figure this out and come up with an equitable remedy. I, being not as creative as most of our wonderful federal judges, don't think I could come up with a perfect remedy here, given that I think the market that would emerge if Google's advertising empire was broken up might not be that much better.
Mm-hmm.
But we'll see.
Yeah.
Maybe they have ideas that I just can't think of.
Right. Come up with something clever. All right. Well, like you said, we will be watching this one
for a long time.
That's right. My story this week comes from the folks over at NPR. This is interesting. Ben, you're a big football fan, aren't you?
I sure am. Coming off, as we record this, my team won last night. So
that's right.
You're lucky to find me in a good mood this
morning.
morning.
San Francisco fan, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
All
49ers for life.
Very good. How you feeling about them this year? How did they look last night? Good?
They look good.
All
yeah,
right.
I mean, they left some good plays on the field, which is, I think, a good sign that they can play better. But pretty dominant opening victory against the New York Jets last night.
All right. Well, good for you.
Yeah.
This story is about the NFL, and the NFL has been expanding their use of facial recognition technology at stadiums. If the NFL calls it facial authentication.
Oh, sounds so nice. Yeah. It's not recognizing you, it's authenticating you.
Right. So, but it has real benefits. It makes it easier for folks to get in and out of the stadium, and particularly for folks who work at the stadium, for them to get in and out It speeds things up rather than having to deal with ID badges and, that sort of thing. You can step up. This thing scans your face, says, yep, this person works here. In you go. Sounds good, right?
Yes, it does. End of story. Let's just have facial recognition everywhere.
Well, the police officers who work at the NFL stadium in Las Vegas are taking issue with this facial recognition technology. So the NFL is requiring facial recognition of the employees of the stadium. And for the purposes of a game, that includes the Las Vegas police departments, because if you're a police officer and you're working an NFL game or a Major League Baseball game, any of that kind of stuff, that falls outside of your regular job. You are there earning overtime. So it's a great way for police officers to make some extra money, to be paid overtime. The league pays their overtime for them to be there.
Considering, though, that I'd have to watch the Raiders, I mean, is that overtime even worth it? Sorry, keep going.
Yeah. And so the police officers union is pushing back on this requirement. They're saying that this is dangerous for police officers, potentially. The fact that their immutable biological information is going to be part of this system, and they're saying that they're not going to go along with it. So, what's good for thee is not good for me. Is that how much of this is that, do you suppose? And it made me think of how many stories we've talked about in the past where the ruling has been that police officers are allowed to be videotaped in public while doing their jobs because they do not have an expectation of privacy
right,
while performing their jobs as public safety officers. So to what degree do you think that extends to something like this?
I think it is. There is a little bit of irony here in the true notion of the Alanis Morissette song, not how people usually use the word irony.
Yeah.
They quoted in this article a representative of the Center for Democracy and Technology talking about the pitfalls of something like Clearview AI,
right?
Where they scrape data based on facial recognition from other services, and Clearview obviously will rely on photos that are taken at these types of events, and they can use those photos to identify criminal suspects. Obviously, that's ironic because the Las Vegas Police Department is so fervently in opposition here as it applies to images of these officers.
Right.
Because normally this is a tool. What you worry about is that facial recognition images are going to be used by law enforcement to arrest people who might have otherwise had an expectation of privacy. So there's the irony of the police union being against this when my guess, and this is just an educated guess, is they're probably supportive of using resources like Clearview AI to get images to effectuate arrests.
Right.
Now, I understand why the police union would fight for its members here and not want to subject them to something like doxing if their image gets out there. It's not like stealing other personally identifiable information.
Right.
It's much more precise. It's biometric. And so it could be something that's used nefariously against law enforcement. But yeah, there is certainly some level of irony here that it's the police union that's objecting when it's really the police that they should be worried about.
I wonder too, let's say you have, your rookie cop, right, who's out there, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, doing the best that they can, picking up some extra money, working this game, subjected to facial recognition. And then years later, that cop gets promoted to be some kind of a detective and wants to work undercover.
Right.
And now their facial information is part of a database. I would hazard to say that as databases do, eventually it's going to be part of other databases, right?
Something like Clearview AI, where
Yeah.
it's pretty easily identifiable somewhere on the internet.
Right.
You can
Just
find that face.
scrapity scrape,
Yep.
right? And you get everybody's faces. And so I could see there being a legitimate concern of trying to keep police officers' faces out of something like this. But I guess at the same time, you can't have it both ways. A police officer is a public servant, and while doing their job, they have to wear an ID with their name on it, right? They have a badge.
Not only that, but everybody who works at these games, as you mentioned, is volunteering because they get the overtime.
Right.
So you do have some meaningful choice in the matter. If you were really concerned about your image being scraped, then you could just simply not do this work and carry on your normal duties as a police officer and avoid those 4 or 5 hours on a Sunday afternoon.
Yeah, that's a good point as well.
And I think that certainly plays into it. I guess I would be more sympathetic if the police department or the police union came out and said, we don't believe in scraping of facial recognition images as it relates to our police officers, and we don't believe in it generally, meaning our department will not use scraped facial recognition images in our criminal investigations.
Right.
They are not saying that.
Yeah.
They are only complaining about how it relates to their members. It's a complicated issue because fans can opt out of the use of facial recognition and law enforcement officials can't. And the Raiders, even though it is voluntary, they do need a certain number of Las Vegas Police Department officials to work those games. So there is a bit of a back and forth here. But ultimately, I'm kind of with you that I would like to see them take a more principled, universally applicable stand against the use of facial recognition images and not be so narrowly opposed only as it applies to the personal data of law enforcement officials.
Yeah.
But we can't always have nice things.
Well, I also wonder, in a stadium where it's blanketed with security cameras, which are, I'm sure, being fed into facial recognition systems.
Totally. 2 guys get into a fight in the stands. It's a good way of identifying them and banning them from future games.
So I guess I'm wondering, how does a police officer opt out of this through their regular wandering around the stadium? Because, we are at the point now where the facial recognition systems not only recognize the faces, but they can read things. So they can read the badge on the police officer's uniform that has the police officer's name, connect those two things. I mean,
I guess the justification, if you're a police officer, is that it's much easier to just scrape images. You can do it in bulk.
Right.
And it's just much more easily searchable than hiring private investigators to go to the stadium and write down the name and badge number of all the different cops. It's just a different set of resources required in each of those circumstances, which from their perspective makes it a fundamentally different issue. And I understand that, even if I don't necessarily agree with it. I mean, I do think every person who goes to such a large-scale event, especially in the age of homeland security threats, where you have police vehicles surrounding the stadium, you have security checkpoints. I think it's hard to have any expectation of privacy once you go to a major event like that.
Right.
But it is, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, and I think we should have one set of rules that applies to law enforcement who are working the game, and that same set of rules should apply to everybody, including all of the other employees who work at a football game. If some employees have the option of opting out of facial recognition, then all employees should.
Mm-hmm.
And if not, vice versa.
Wonder if the team owner gets to opt out. Bet they do.
Have you ever seen the team owner of the Las Vegas Raiders? You should Google a picture. I could spot that guy from 20 miles away by his bowl cut.
Yes, I know who you're talking about. It's a look. It's a choice. It's a choice. All right. Well, we will have a link to that story in the show notes. And of course, we would love to hear from you. If there's something you'd like us to consider for the show, you can email us. It's caveat@n2k.com. The IT world used to be simpler. You only had to secure and manage environments that you controlled. Then came new technologies and new ways to work. Now, employees, apps, and networks are everywhere. This means poor visibility, security gaps, and added risk. That's why Cloudflare created the first-ever connectivity cloud. Visit cloudflare.com to protect your business everywhere you do business. Ben, I recently had the pleasure of speaking with Shane Fry. He is CTO of an organization called Run Safe Security, and we were talking about the new Spacecraft Security Act and some of the challenges that come along with that. Here's my conversation with Shane Fry.
We've been, as a country, as really a world, putting things in space for a long time. And when we first went to space, the issue was, let's just get to space, right? All the challenges that came with the Apollo program and things like that. But, we've been putting a lot of satellites into space, communications, imaging satellites, and those are starting to have had for a long time, rather, communication back to Earth. And for the longest time, you sent something into space and that was it. We didn't really think about cyber. We just thought about, how do we get images back? How do we talk to people that are in space? How do we talk to these satellites, the International Space Station? And if you think about it, that's really the mission. So let's go do that. But as we've seen kind of an increase in cyber attacks over, I'll say the last probably 20 years, devices that aren't IT systems, that aren't end user laptops or desktops or servers in a data center, are starting to get attacked at kind of higher and higher frequency. And, spacecraft are very interesting targets from a national security perspective. And, I think we saw that, it was maybe last week or the week before, where, Russia said, well, hey, we're going to attack the GPS system. We're going to attack US-based satellites if Ukraine doesn't stop their offensive. And, I think that's kind of fascinating, because we're seeing not only that these devices, these systems can be vulnerable, that nation states are willing to attack them for a nation that's not directly involved in war. I think that's a fascinating development.
In the early days of the space program, as we were putting more and more things into orbit and making more and more impressive journeys, was there kind of an international gentleman's agreement that we would keep our hands to ourselves? And was there a point where people stopped believing that?
I think so. To be honest, that time was a little before me when I was in the industry, but absolutely. Everyone kind of in the space field understands that, our satellites are kind of brittle infrastructure. They're not grounded to power. You can't drive someone out or fly someone in a helicopter out to fix something if it breaks, right? And you see that in all the redundancy that NASA puts in the systems that go into space, right? We've got to care about, all kinds of radiation and power failures and things like that. And so, understanding that, it's not the same exactly as nuclear deterrence, but it's a similar thing of, well, all my satellites that I need to put up there can be interfered with and messed with, but so can all of my adversaries. So let's just keep everything kind of peaceful in space. And that's definitely starting to change. And I think, it's not space related, but there was an issue probably 10 or 12 years ago where there was some random security researcher that was collecting drone footage that was being sent unencrypted from, military drones. And that kind of sparked we can attack things in the sky kind of mindset. And that's really extending now into space. And you see where Starlink went into space and was really beneficial to Ukraine at the beginning of the Ukraine-Russia war, as a target now that Russia would, I'm sure, be happy to attack. And if it could cripple some of the other efforts that Ukraine's having. So, there's definitely been that peacefulness. And to the point where, there have been a handful of collisions in space that were they avoidable? Were they on purpose? I don't know that we'll ever know, but there have been a few incidences of nation states, I think, trying to flex their muscle, saying we can do more in space if you want to take it there.
Well, yeah, that was going to be my next question. Like, has there been any saber rattling of, hey, here's our demonstrating our capabilities to kind of keep each other in line?
Yeah, I don't know of anything from a cyber side of things, but there's definitely been some mechanical saber rattling, right? I think the U.S. has done some testing to say we could shoot down a satellite in space if we wanted to, and I think it was China that rammed a satellite into another satellite. It was one that they were going to be deorbiting, but I think the experts would say that they weren't just trying to deorbit this satellite faster; they were trying to show that they have capability in space. So it doesn't happen often, but it's definitely happening. And on the cyber side, there's more and more probably pre-staging of stuff happening, and Putin threatening to take out GPS systems is an effort there, right? Because cyber attacks are interesting. Unlike missile strikes, where you see something blow up, it's spectacular. I think about the scene in Iron Man often, where they bring the generals out and they launch something into the side of the mountain and show, look at how awesome this is. In cyber, you don't really have that. And so you can be vocal about it and not have to show your capability, which is kind of interesting.
So in July, we had a couple of congresspeople, Congressman Frost and Congressman Beyer, introduce this Spacecraft Cybersecurity Act. What does it entail?
Yeah, so it's really one thing, but there's kind of a second order implication. So they're really looking at, NASA has requirements for cybersecurity, but how does NASA then push that requirement down to the contractors it works with? So you think of the Boeings, the SpaceXs, the United Launch Alliances, and many more, where NASA has a need to push these requirements, but they've found through some Inspector General audits back in 2019 that NASA is not pushing those requirements, or they're not enforcing those requirements. And so on the one hand, the bill is trying to enforce that implementation of cybersecurity requirements on NASA spacecraft. But then it's also kind of broadening the picture to not look at just the spacecraft as it's in flight, in operation, but also doing cybersecurity, what I'll call left of flight, in manufacturing and development. And that's super important, right? If you're an adversary carrying out a cyber attack on something flying very fast in space can be challenging. But if you can mess up the manufacturing process, or have a cyber attack on some quality system, and so a part that shouldn't pass quality now passes quality, that can have devastating impacts. So they're really trying to push not only the contractors doing NASA work to do more cybersecurity, but also trying to get that cybersecurity to the entire ecosystem for those spacecraft, which is often ignored, not just in space, but in all of kind of critical infrastructure as well.
So is this a case of the federal government using their purchasing power to try to influence the whole food chain here? I mean, a company like SpaceX, could it be that they have to meet these new requirements if sometime in the future they want their satellites to be used for government contracts?
I think so. It's not explicitly laid out, I think, because it's leaning on existing regulations that have been passed for NASA cybersecurity requirements. But it is definitely trying to get an implementation plan from NASA on how they're going to implement this, which part of that is going to be technical, right? What are the actual requirements for cybersecurity? Do we have to do things like memory safety or secure boot or encrypted communications? But it's also going to have to be budgetary, right? Because as we know, contractors are going to do what they are getting paid to do. And if there's no budget to do cybersecurity, they're not going to do cybersecurity. with few exceptions. And so I think part of that implementation plan will be how they plan to budget for those cybersecurity requirements, because new programs absolutely are going to have those requirements, and the contractors are going to have to bid cybersecurity services, labor, products to meet those requirements. But they're also likely going to have to do this for existing awarded contracts. And so that's going to require budget plus ups and things like that. And so while this isn't an appropriation bill, I think there will be implications to the budget when this implementation plan gets done, no later than 270 days from when it becomes law.
In general, how is it being received by the various parties that are going to be affected by it?
That's actually something I'm not too sure of. We do some work with one of the smaller companies, and they're on the leading edge of cybersecurity. They actually have been working with us to implement cybersecurity for their satellite systems outside of NASA requirements because they know it's the best practices. But I'm not in a lot of communication with some of the kind of policy leaders at, say, SpaceX or Boeing to really have a great understanding there.
Is there a general sense that this is a good area to be focused on, that this deserves the kind of attention that this bill brings to it?
I think so. I mean, the federal government has been pushing cybersecurity since, probably 2014. And we saw in 2019, some directives for the Department of Defense programs to do more cybersecurity. And we continue to see kind of an uptick in cybersecurity funding and focus across the U.S. government. And so it's broadly, I think it's being very well received. The threat has never been more real. We're seeing a lot of critical infrastructure attacks with Volt Typhoon, and that's only going to move into space at some point. So I think nobody wants to be the space contractor that's unable to launch because of a mechanical problem. They also don't want to be on the front page of the Wall Street Journal because they had a cyber attack and there was a loss of life or loss of mission as a result of the cyber attack on their space system. So I think it's going to be pretty well received.
Ben, what do you think?
I think it's a great idea. I'm glad to see that this legislation has a couple of sponsors in the House of Representatives. There have been credible Russian and Chinese threats against our space infrastructure, against NASA, and we would never want to put our astronauts or anybody else who works in the space industry in any danger. So what the legislation would do, requiring a cybersecurity protection plan for any manufacturers who work with NASA, who are contractors of NASA, I think is a good one. And in that sense, it was an interesting conversation.
Yeah, it's always interesting to me that the federal government's ability to use the power of their gigantic purse to move things along, even beyond their direct control.
Right.
To say, if you want to do business with us and the people you do business with want to do business with us, here's what you got to do. And
that is their only method of control, really. I mean, they can't exercise a degree of control over private enterprise unless there is directly a government connection, and it's usually in the world of contracting.
Yeah.
You can't purchase from any company unless they do X. It's a good way for Congress to kind of, with a not-so-hidden hand, control the practices of a private industry.
Yeah, and it'd be interesting to see how this makes its way through, and then also, you got to think about all the stuff that's up there functioning, working fine, but that stuff stays up there for decades. We've got communications satellites that are doing their thing, have been for years, and will continue to do so from here on out. But as Shane pointed out, you can't just drive a pickup truck up there and perform a hardware update.
No, not that easy. In fact, when we do manage to get astronauts up to, say, the International Space Station, they end up being stuck there for 6 months, which has been in the news recently.
Well, I guess,
not easy.
I guess when we had the space shuttle, that was, we could make some repairs like we did to Hubble, but still not very practical.
Not at all, yeah.
All right, well, our thanks to Shane Fry for joining us. Again, he is the Chief Technology Officer at RunSafe Security, and we appreciate him taking the time. This September 18th and 19th in Denver, a tight community of leading experts is gathering to tackle the toughest cybersecurity challenges we face. It's happening at MWise, the unique conference built by practitioners for practitioners. Brought to you by Mandiant, now part of Google Cloud, MWise features one-to-one access with industry experts and fresh insights into the topics that matter most, right now, to frontline practitioners. Register early and save at mwise.io/cyberwire. That's mwise.io/cyberwire. That is our show. We want to thank all of you for listening. We'd love to know what you think of this podcast. Your feedback ensures we deliver the insights that keep you a step ahead in the rapidly changing world of cybersecurity. If you like our show, please share a rating and review in your favorite podcast app. Please also fill out the survey in the show notes or send an email to caveat@n2k.com. We're privileged that N2K Cyberwire is part of the daily routine of the most influential leaders and operators in the public and private sector, from the Fortune 500 to many of the world's preeminent intelligence and law enforcement agencies. N2K makes it easy for companies to optimize your biggest investment, your people. We make you smarter about your teams while making your team smarter. Learn how at n2k.com. This episode is produced by Liz Stokes. Our executive producer is Jennifer Iben. The show is mixed by Trey Hester. Our executive editor is Brandon Karp. Peter Kilpie is our publisher. I'm Dave Bittner.
And I'm Ben Yellen.
Thanks for listening.